Hey everybody, welcome to For Food's Sake, the podcast bringing you down-to-earth dialogues about the food on your plate and its many impacts on people and the planet. My name is Matteo De Vos, and without further ado, let's talk about food. Hey everybody, welcome back to the For Food's Sake podcast. In this episode, we talk to Simon Fairlie. Simon is an editor of the Land magazine in the UK, and he's the author of Meat, a Benign Extravagance. He also runs a micro-dairy farm of Jersey cows in Dorset, in England, in the southwest. But today we talk about Simon's book, Meat, a Benign Extravagance, which really is a fantastic book that meticulously scrutinizes all the major environmental claims you've heard about the livestock industry and about eating meat. And make no mistake, the book makes no excuses for the unsustainable industrial livestock system that we currently have, but it makes a really powerful but nuanced case for including livestock in a sustainable agricultural system. And what's particularly refreshing about the book is that it doesn't only challenge the vegan narrative, but also the so-called cowboys narrative on the other side of the debate, where certain people are convinced that carbon farming can sequester all of the world's carbon dioxide that's currently in the atmosphere in our soils. So it's a very balanced and nuanced debate. It's definitely one of the most fascinating books I've read in a long time on the role of livestock in the food system. And I'd really encourage you, especially if you're a vegetarian like me or vegan, to really keep an open mind here and listen to these arguments, because I really think we need to start having these types of conversations more often to move the debate forward. And like I said, this book makes no excuses for the current industrial livestock system we have, but it makes a very compelling argument for including livestock. And Simon encourages what he calls a default livestock diet. So in our conversation, we talk about some of these ideas, and we really do go into some detail dispelling some of the misleading claims or misleading facts that are currently circulating in well-known documentaries like Cowspiracy, in media headlines, and even in academia in some cases. So I'll leave it there, and now without further ado, here is Simon Fairlie. We have Simon Fairlie on the line. Simon, thanks for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure.
So what I'd like to do in this precious time we have together, Simon, is quite ambitious. I'd like to cover a lot of the main points you make in your book, in Meat, a Benign Extravagance, where you challenge really everything from the often quoted inefficiencies of eating meat, so the so-called feed conversion ratios, to the excessive water use of raising livestock, and also the reported large amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with eating meat. And what I want to do is really convey to listeners some of the nuances that you bring forward in the book behind the role of livestock in farming and in our diets. And I guess really to challenge and question the widely distributed figures that we're seeing on social media today and in media headlines about meat and its impact on the environment. But before we get started, I just I'll be the first to admit, really, just a disclaimer that I've cited some of the figures in support of veganism that we're about to challenge, and so your book was very refreshing in allowing me to challenge some of these assumptions. But at the same time, some of these figures really did help convince me of the urgency of the problem in the way that we currently consume meat today, and it's frankly also one of the reasons I started this podcast. It was to find out more. But these figures are. Might have helped me on the one hand, but I'm also aware that misleading figures, they clearly do more harm than good in this transition towards a sustainable food system. And I think probably most importantly, if these figures are misleading, they're failing to represent the diverse ways in which livestock are reared and used around the globe, which I think does a massive disservice really to millions of farmers around the world. So I'd like to talk about that, and then finally finish on your vision of agriculture and the concept of default livestock, and talk a little bit about your vision of ruralising society, and ultimately I think also why you think a vegan diet and vegan agriculture, laudable though it may be for the individual, as you say in your book, is neither sensible nor attainable for society as a whole. So, like I said, quite ambitious. Maybe let's start simple with if you could just start by briefly describing your background and why you got interested in issues around agriculture more generally and livestock in particular.
I got interested in this because I was living in on a community where I was doing looking after the cows and the pigs, and there were a fair amount of vegans and vegetarians living on this community. Well, only one vegan, but it was basically a vegetarian ethos, and we were simply not consuming a lot of food that we were producing. The pigs were really there to mop up the food waste, and if we hadn't had the pig, well, when we didn't have the pigs, it was either badgers or rats that got the food waste, and so forth. We were producing large amounts of protein and fat that were byproducts of the dairy that simply weren't being eaten, and I was managing to sell a certain amount of it outside. But that was difficult because of health and safety regulations, which we couldn't conform to because we were too small. And so I started looking into the arguments for not eating meat that were the basis of what the community was, this ethos in the community, and weighing up. There were some interesting and good arguments, but at the end of the day, I couldn't find any cogent argument for not. There were plenty of good arguments for eating less meat than people normally do in society, but no good arguments for not eating it altogether. Well, not environmental arguments, anyway.
Yeah, so in terms of environmental arguments, I mean, I think one of the first arguments you challenge in your book is this idea of the kind of inherent inefficiencies of meat. So in terms of the units of nutrition that are fed to an animal versus the units of nutrition that are then produced for us to consume, and kind of the standard vegan argument here is very much that it's especially unjustifiable given the fact that almost a billion people are malnourished today, that we're still feeding these inefficient animals. Could you comment on this inefficiency and how you see this?
Yes, well, I mean, that argument is 50% correct, insofar as approximately half the food that is fed to animals is globally is food that people could eat, and that is translated into meat or dairy inefficiently in comparison to what the human beings ate, the wheat or the barley or whatever it was that's being fed. But that's only about half what's fed to livestock. And there are somewhere between the third and the half of the world's livestock are what I call default livestock, which and other people have called them ecological leftovers, which means that they have very little environmental impact because they're basically, the livestock are byproducts or co-products of something else that is going on. That something else is usually, but not always, an agricultural system designed primarily to produce vegetable products like grains and potatoes and so forth. But it also produces a certain amount of wastage or other surplus, which is most efficiently fed to livestock, and at no extra or very little additional burden on the environment. I can go into that in more detail if you want.
Yeah, please do. Sure.
Well, yes. I mean, perhaps the first point to make is that although grain is fed inefficiently to livestock, there's something called the feed buffer, which means that in order to ensure that there is enough grain to feed everybody in the world in a bad harvest, that one has to sow sufficient so that all the other years there is a surplus. There has to be a surplus in of grain in every year but the worst year in order to ensure that everybody gets fed. One has to sow more than one needs to fend off catastrophe. And by far the best way of doing this is really to, the most useful way to use this surplus is to put it into meat. You can also turn it into alcohol if you want, and turn it into whiskey, which some might think was more beneficial. You could put it in your car, but both of these solutions are less rewarding than simply keeping it in the food chain and feeding it to livestock. And it represents, in a good year, something like 5 kilos of meat per person per year. If you look at the difference between, the best year in terms of grain production and the worst, which is what I did in the book. So although most grain production, which is dedicated for animals, is inefficient, that is always, except in the very worst year, going to be a surplus. And the best way of using that surplus is to feed it to livestock. And the best way of encouraging people to plant sufficient to avoid a famine is by pricing it, having an incentive to do so. The main incentive is that if there's a surplus of grain for human consumption, it can be fed to livestock, and that maintains the price. So that's the first avenue by which livestock can be viewed as being sustainable. Secondly, a large amount of livestock in the world, particularly in places like Africa and India, is fed not on grain that's grown specifically to feed livestock, nor even on grazing, but on waste produce. And that waste can either be crop residues, or it can be processing residues from the food industry, or it's food waste that's thrown out at home or in hospitals. As we know, there's a huge amount of it. And there is no doubt, although this can be anaerobically digested or composted, by far the most effective way of using it is to keep it in the food chain and feed it mostly to pigs. Can be fed to chickens, but the best way is feeding it to pigs. So that's what we do where I live at the moment. We run a sort of guest house in the country where we feed about 30 people a day. We have a fair amount of food waste. It's inevitable if you're trying to provide sufficient food for everybody. And if we didn't feed it to pigs, we'd have a rat problem. And even though we are a vegetarian kitchen here, and we have a number of vegetarians, everybody is very happy to see the food go to the pigs, because that's by far the most efficient way of dealing with it.
You had a great quote in the book, kind of drawing this discrepancy between, while meat is the rich man's luxury in many parts of the world, it's the poor man's necessity. So.
Yeah, well, that's very true. Well, actually, it's basically for poor people who don't have access to land. Because in order to grow vegetables, I mean, this is a bit of a side issue, but we can certainly cover this now. In order to grow grain and vegetables, you need to have access to land. You either need to own it or be able to rent it. And if you're a poor person, very often you can't do that, and you're simply a landless labourer. But the landless labourer can always, or usually, find enough money to buy a goat or a cow or a pig or something like that, and then they can scavenge feed for that animal from basically the cast-off of wealthier people. And there are millions of people in the poor world who live like that. I mean, we associate meat with luxury, but actually, what the FAO has discovered is in a lot of the poorer countries, more of the poor people keep livestock than the wealthy people do. So there's a social issue there, but it is very much to do with scavenging. The poor people have the time to go and scavenge food and use waste that otherwise wouldn't be used. And the best way for them to use it, by far, is to put it into livestock and then get milk or meat out of it.
I thought a really interesting point as well, just on whilst we're talking about these feed buffers and this recycling of food waste, especially for pigs. What I thought was fascinating in the book too was the closure of I think it was in Austria and in Germany, that two of EU's largest and most profitable recycling industries, which relied on this waste being given to pigs. To, what was it, 6 million pigs?
Yes.
And it's just fascinating that it's just, in an age where we're talking increasingly about recycling and food waste being this enormous scandal, that we have this solution in front of our eyes that's not being utilized.
Yeah. Well, that really kept the feeding swill to pigs was banned in Europe. I mean, it still carries on in the United States and in Japan and Korea, but it was banned in Europe after the foot and mouth epidemic in the UK, which was attributed to a bit of contaminated pig meat getting into a pig feed system which wasn't working properly. But and it's just destroyed our whole industry there. And there is a move to reverse that now, because basically it's turned what was an asset, i.e. waste food, into a problem. And now it's to dispose of your waste food, instead of just giving it to pig keepers, you have to pay for it to be removed and taken away and anaerobically digested, or even landfilled. A third form of what I call default livestock is mainly ruminants who are used to harness fertility. This is mainly to do with organic systems of agriculture. Organic agriculture requires a fertility-building element in the rotation, and that is basically grass. Including grass, I include legumes like fixed nitrogen, like lucerne and clover and sainfoin and so forth. And these are traditionally and typically harnessed by livestock, either from the sort of hinterland, the rough grazing. Sheep or cows are put out to graze and then brought in, and their manure is then used. I mean, that was a classic traditional form of organic farming. It's used less nowadays, but we might have to revert to that even when fossil fuels become more expensive and artificial fertilizers become more expensive. It also operates on a sort of in-farm basis, where you have a rotation of crops moving from, say, 2 or 3 years in grains and potatoes and so forth, and then 4 to 5 or 6 years in grass, and that's what maintains the fertility of an organic system. And while it's in grass, then one of the best ways, the most effective ways of managing it is by grazing it. You're hardly losing any of the nutrients, because most of the nutrients go into a cow at one end and come out the other. And anyway, an awful lot of the nitrogen that's being secured is not in what's growing above the ground, but is what in the roots that's growing within the ground. So you can have an organic rotation system that is stock-free. It just grows grass, and then they disc or plough it in and grow grain or whatever on the land that the year before was under grass. That works. You can do the same system by having a number of years of it fed to livestock, with grass fed to livestock, and then that gets ploughed in, and it's the difference in efficiency between the two systems is marginal, and what you get out of the livestock system is a much higher and more varied kind of protein coming out of it, more fat coming out of it, a wider variety of diet coming out of it, and there also, for anybody who's a farmer, the joy of keeping animals, which is a huge pleasure for all the people who do it.
Right. So you mentioned here that stockless systems, so a vegan farming system which would rely on green manure, could, in theory, be in some respects as effective. And one of the arguments that I often hear from vegans is that argument about freeing up grasslands for rewilding.
Yes.
So why don't we use a vegan system where at the end of the day we're able to rewild more of the landscape?
Well, I mean, that is by far the strongest argument for veganism, and it's one that I did when I wrote my book, which was now 7-8 years ago. It was very hard to find any vegans making that argument. Now they are. Perhaps they've read my book. But it's certainly a stronger argument, and it really depends what you want, what human beings want, in terms of how much biodiversity and wildness do human beings want, and how much do they want of a farmed landscape with the sort of biodiversity that exists in that. I would have thought a bit of both was probably what it would come down to, and I'm certainly not against some rewilding, especially on the land that's less productive in terms of agriculture. But I cannot see the point of going totally vegan Firstly, because of the default livestock that comes off waste food and so forth, because of the feed buffer that I mentioned, and also other factors like wherever you've got wind generators or solar panels, you need to keep the land clear. And the best way of keeping it clear is by putting animals on it. There are all sorts of reasons for having animals that, and if you're having them, you might not eat them. And another reason is conservation grazing. I mean, a lot of real wilding, or something pretty close to real wilding, is done using livestock, because if you don't have ruminants there, then what you basically get is a load of trees coming to a sort of climax forest, which is fine over a certain area, but we don't want to cover the whole of Britain with primeval forest. And in terms of biodiversity and the number of species in this country, they would drastically diminish, certainly in Britain, because the richness of British flora and fauna comes from the fact that a large amount of the landscape has been grazed, and that allows sun to get in, and the edgeland between the forest and the grassland creates all sorts of variegated areas where many different plants and insects and so forth can thrive. And the only way to do that, unless you're going to go around with tractors everywhere for no other reason than to let in the sunshine, the most sensible way to do that is to have some form of grazing. And that's what, for example, NEP is doing in the much-cited rewilding project in the south of England. And they're using fairly primitive forms of cattle and so forth, and getting not enormous amounts of meat off it, but they're still getting 75 tons a year or something. Almost everything that humans are doing is likely to have some level of animals in it as a co-product or a part of the system. Animals are part of nature, and the idea of sort of somehow expunging them from any human system is completely daft, and it just doesn't make sense.
And another thing you mentioned in your book, which I think is important to touch upon, is the water use. So kind of the typical statistic you see is that 1 pound of beef uses up about 10,000 liters of water.
Or even more. 100,000 to a kilo is the sort of thing that often gets quoted. Well, I mean, I followed a lot of these figures up and the references to them, and what they're mainly based on is the amount of land that falls on an area which a cow is grazing on, and that's certainly the figure of 100,000 litres per kilo that David Pimentel and Robert Goodland were putting forward, which is widely quoted. I did some calculations on one of our cows, and at the absolute maximum, our cow consumed in his lifetime about 50 tons of water, and even that was, it was very difficult to work out how he consumed any of that. I mean, basically a cow, it ingests water at one end, and it lets most of it out at the other end, and it goes back into the land. And this is what the water would do, whether the cow were there or not, frankly. There's a certain amount used in the slaughterhouse and so forth, and in processing, but the figures are just complete fantasy. The only way in which they anywhere get near realistic is if you're irrigating large amounts of very dry land to feed cows in feedlots, and then there is a water burden, which I grant you, but that sort of industrial livestock husbandry is not one that I would support anyway. I mean, I worked out our cow, absolutely the maximum, it came to about 400 litres per kilo of beef.
And I think probably the most widely cited figure, now that we're talking about figures being distributed, is the greenhouse gas emissions one from the FAO Livestock's Long Shadow report. So the 18% that livestock are responsible for more greenhouse gas emissions than all transport combined. And then a more extreme version that I've seen floating around too is the one from Goodland in Livestock and Climate Change, that livestock is responsible for 51% of all greenhouse gas emissions.
That's complete fantasy, isn't it? It's, even the the film Cowspiracy quoted that at the beginning, and they agreed to take that out of the film because everybody said this is just absolute nonsense. The The figure, the FAO figure, which was 18% of human-generated greenhouse gas was caused by livestock, that they've since reduced that to 14.5%. In my view, that's still an exaggeration for a number of quite complex reasons. One of the reasons is that they don't actually, they say this is what is produced by livestock, but they don't actually look at what, take into account the opportunity cost so far of that, i.e. what would be produced in the way of methane and nitrous oxide if you were to get rid of all livestock, because other things would happen. So, for example, with methane, if you got rid of livestock, livestock only produce about a third of all man-made methane, and only about a sixth of naturally produced methane. If you got rid of them, first of all, you'd have wild animals, you'd probably get more wetlands, you're quite likely to have more forest fires and so forth. And all these things produce methane as well. So they really don't know how much additional methane is caused by having livestock rather than some other land management system. I mean, if you went back to rewilding, you get a lot more wetlands. And wetlands produce more methane than cows do. And that includes rice production. And of course, the other big methane producer, which produces more methane than cows, is fossil fuels. That they produce slightly more methane than ruminants do at the moment. And we have to get rid of the fossil fuels anyway. So if we get rid of the fossil fuels, you've reduced human methane production by about 25% straight away. And that actually will be, because methane is kind of sort of turbocharged carbon, i.e. it has a greater warming effect, but only for a short period of time. What that means is that if you've only got to reduce methane production by quite a small amount, and then the level of methane in the atmosphere will stabilize. This is not the case with carbon dioxide. Every bit of carbon dioxide that you take out of the Earth's crust through fossil fuels stays there for years and years, for thousands of years. Whereas if you halve the amount of livestock, that will probably stabilize the amount of methane in the atmosphere straight away. And halving the amount of livestock, I think, is something I would approve of. If, as we have to do, we stop using fossil fuels, then an amount of methane equivalent to the amount emitted by domestic livestock, that will be saved. And in fact, that will be saved in a much more thorough way, because it will be carbon kept locked up in the crust of the Earth and not let out into the geosphere.
Yeah, and you mentioned as well in terms of greenhouse gases that one of the reasons why it's so elevated, the figure, is also that they're misallocating the emissions that come from deforestation, right? So it's something like 7% of that 18% comes from deforestation.
But that in fact is what one of the things they adjusted, and that's why one of the reasons why they lowered it from 18% to 14.5% is because they conceded that they made mistakes in that regard and lowered it. I think that was about 3 or 4 years after the book came out.
Yeah, and I think one of the main takeaways that I got from the book and from a lot of these statistics is that really it's a question of using certain statistics, whether it's on water or whether it's on greenhouse gas emissions and deforestation, of an industrialized livestock system. So if you're using, I don't know, the example of feedlots in the United States, and then extrapolating those numbers around the world with documentaries or with media headlines to imply that all livestock production is produced in this way. And I think that's one of the main takeaways I think people have to understand, is the diversity of ways of raising livestock, and that the kind of more traditional ways of doing so, grass-fed rather than grain-fed, has just very little to do with this industrialized process.
Yes, quite exactly. Yeah, and also it's if you're rearing livestock on a small scale, then you have the ability anyway to rear it in a much more humane way than occurs in factory farms for pigs, for example.
So I'd like to now touch on some of the solutions and the kind of vision which we've briefly talked about already that you see for agriculture. So you mentioned the default livestock system. You also mentioned in kind of the last chapters of your book this move towards a more ruralized, decentralized, low carbon permaculture economy. Could you talk a little bit about that concept and maybe also how it's been received really in the last 8 years and how you see it today?
Well, I don't know how many people got to the end of the book, so I don't know about that. But it's probably got less. That bit got less attention than the rest of the book, basically because it requires a whole revisioning of society as a whole. But I mean, what I would like to see is more value attached to meat and livestock products and dairy products, so that they are regarded as a bit of an extravagance, a luxury, so that livestock farmers can spend a proper amount of time looking after their livestock rather than, at the moment, dairy farming and just doesn't have time to do that properly. And I suppose at the end of the book, I was looking very much at an economy with more localized, less use of fossil fuels, and more use of things like animal traction and so forth, of local markets. And also, crucially, if we're going to get rid of fossil fuels, artificial fertilizers are going to become a lot more expensive. And anyway, it's agreed that their impact on soil structure and so forth is nefarious. If we're going to reduce the use of artificial fertilizers because they're expensive, then we have to be much more efficient in our use of organic fertilizers. And livestock are the main provider of organic fertilizers, because I mean you could use vegetable biomass, but you need machines to deal with it on any scale. It's just not physically possible. Well, I won't say it's not physically possible, but it's just huge amounts of work to provide organic biomass without using machines, unless you use animals, because what livestock are is they not only harvest biomass, that they then they're sort of chipper shredders. In fact, they chew it all up. They then digest it, and they can carry it to where you want it. And this has always been one of the main foundations of organic agriculture, is using livestock to harness biomass and fertility and then bring it to the place where you want it. And if you're going to do that, it's got to be done on a dispersed scale, with a certain amount of livestock on a mixed farm, rather than farms dedicated to producing nothing but beef or nothing but dairy. You're then having livestock as part of a whole agroecological system.
Yeah, and I think that for me makes a lot of sense. And it's funny that you said that the last part of your book got the least attention, because I mean, for me, really that's where it gets interesting. It's where, what are the implications of truly having a sustainable food system? I mean, ultimately, this debate on whether we have a vegan agricultural system or a livestock-based one ignores the wider problem, which is that if we don't decentralize, it's very difficult to kind of, well, first of all, the problem of fertility, not just animals, as you just mentioned, but also human waste. Is how do you distribute this on the land? And I think the final point you make is so strong, but for me at the same time so worrying, which is that it really ultimately, I think, comes down to this kind of deep-rooted prejudice that people have against rural people and rural places, and this was also very much the discussion of my last podcast, which was about the last acceptable prejudice. So I've been reading a lot of Wendell Berry and Wes Jackson recently, and I think that's ultimately I think for many millennials, my age, probably the scariest thing is, if all it takes is moving towards a more plant-based diet and living in urban centers, I don't think that's such a frightening prospect for the majority of young people. But I think it's so deeply ingrained that we're an urban people that we, the idea of having to move back to the land, whatever that means, is, I think, so much more terrifying and deserves a lot more attention than it's getting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I would agree with you there. I think it's worth bearing in mind that it's only very recently that that globally there were more people living in cities than there were in rural areas. That only, what was it, 3 or 4 years ago. And although in in the United States and in Britain, far more people living in cities than there are rurally, because all the work is done by machines. In poorer countries, that's not the case. There are still huge numbers of people living and working in the countryside. A lot of perhaps slightly unproven arguments saying that the majority of our food in the world is still produced by small-scale farmers. And when you look at the size and the unsustainability of the cities that are being produced, that are emerging at the moment from the fact that from this anti-rural prejudice and this idea that, well, actually we make agriculture efficient by bringing in lots of machines and pushing everybody in towns to sell chewing gum or whatever. How long that can be sustained, we don't know.
I guess that leads me to my final question, which is always a difficult one, but not the majority now, but almost half of people around the world still live in rural areas. But obviously, the trend is very much towards urbanization, and so. Yeah. I mean, what do you see are the prospects of moving towards a more decentralized, ruralized society? Do you see trends, or do you have any optimism that despite the global trend towards urbanization, that this rural vision is still possible?
I'd feel a bit more optimistic if most of the youth didn't seem to be totally obsessed with their mobile phones. But I think there's some room for optimism there. I mean, the organisations like Via Campesina, for example, which means the way of the peasant in Spanish, and which is a global organisation of a global umbrella group of peasant organisations in many different countries through the world, who are raising the profile of a modern peasant existence, and that's a modern peasant existence with access to mobile phones and so forth, and putting up a pretty rigid defence of a rural way of life. And certainly a lot more needs to be done in this respect, but people's attitudes change. I'm not despairing completely, but I do agree that at the moment the wind is blowing the other way.
Well, it's good you haven't completely lost hope. Do you have plans for a new book or anything anytime soon?
Maybe. I'll see. I mean, I've just done a book on a completely different subject, which is on which wouldn't interest you. It's on the English planning system. But I kind of think people should only produce about one book every 10 years. That's enough, really.
That sounds good. Well, I look forward to another book then in 2 years' time.
Okay, all right.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Simon. Really appreciate it.
Okay. Well, thank you. And you obviously read the book very thoroughly, which is always encouraging.
I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thanks so much.
Good. Cheers. Okay. Thank you.
That is it for now, guys. As always, if you'd like to support the podcast, you can do so by subscribing via iTunes, by rating and reviewing the show via iTunes. You can find, stream, and listen to the podcast on all of your favorite podcast apps, or you can go directly to our website, that's www.forfoodsake.me, and stream them directly from there. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. The social media handle for all those platforms is For Food's Sake Me. Thanks, guys. I'll see you next time.